that case, I want Mr. Price to start off. He's going to talk about 5 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes, about when we talk about redevelopment matters and what we did 2 years ago, same place at Learning Name, we talked about a redevelopment agency. And he's going to talk about the benefits of having us be our own redevelopment. So with that.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll be brief. I do have a handout which lists, in my opinion, the benefits of redevelopment, which will be the focus of my presentation. Let me just, before I do that, indicate there are 6 important factors to bear in mind when the council moves forward with redevelopment. The first is that in order for a property to be designated, it does have to meet the criteria under the law. It used to be called a blighted property. There's a set of criteria in the statute. Only under those circumstances can a property be designated as an area in need of redevelopment. It doesn't always apply. For example, Alfred Avenue, it did not apply there, so we had to stick with traditional zoning. Second thing is there was a change in the law fairly recently that allows a governing body to proceed under what they call a non-condemnation redevelopment, where you state up front that you're not going to use the power of condemnation. And this has reduced the risk and a lot of opposition, and in my opinion, it's not always the way to go, but if you do non-condemnation redevelopment, it removes a lot of legal risk and makes it a lot easier. Third thing is that redevelopment, in my opinion, works best when you cooperate and work with the property owner or the designated redeveloper. It doesn't have to be an adversarial situation. It's always better if they're involved from the get-go. Another word in regard to payments in lieu of taxes or tax abatements. If an area is so designated, the council has the power to use that as an incentive. It doesn't mean you have to do that, but you can do that, and sometimes that's the difference between a project going forward or not.
How long has we worked together that we're talking about pilots?
Right. So the fifth thing is that in terms of proceeding, it's a lengthy process. It does involve a lot of legal steps. You don't circumvent the public input. There's a lot of opportunities for the public to be involved and to be transparent. In my opinion, where redevelopment fails or doesn't pass legal muster is on the technical requirements. So it takes a little bit longer than traditional zoning, but if it's done right, it does succeed. And the last point is that there's a less stringent form where you can do redevelopment called an area in need of rehabilitation. The criteria that would apply are less stringent, and there's 2 things that make it different from areas in need of redevelopment. You can't use condemnation, and then the tax abatement, the maximum period for which properties can be granted tax abatements of 5 years as opposed to 30 years. So I just wanted to give you that. I have a handout here. I brought about 20 copies, so I'll hand copies out to the council, and if there are enough, there may be some which the members of the public can have. So essentially, if we're talking about the controlling of land use in New Jersey, there's 3 ways that you can do it. One is through zoning, which everybody knows about. The second is where you seek a use variance from the Zoning Board of Adjustment, and the third is through redevelopment. And redevelopment used to be used as a drastic governmental intervention when the other methods have failed. Now you don't have to go through that process, and it does have advantages over traditional zoning and variances. The first advantage is that you can take a particular parcel and you can essentially custom the zoning criteria and the land use regulations without the threat of being of a legal spot zone. The list of uses can be very specific. You can just list 1 or 2 specific uses. In zoning, essentially what you have to do is you have to allow all of the class of uses. So if, for example, you're dealing with retail uses, there could be a challenge is, I'm a barbershop and you're only permitting convenience stores. Why aren't I permitted? In a redevelopment plan, you can be as specific as that. The next thing is that the governing body or the planning agency can work cooperatively with the developer on a concept plan and decide exactly what is going to get built, and then draft a redevelopment plan or the zoning regulations around that to specifically allow that development, something that can be done with traditional zoning. Moreover, the bulk regulations can be fit to that specific situation, not where you have a generic standards where you end up with lots of bulk variances, where you may end up before the zoning board and need a bunch of D variances. The council will have a lot more control over the architecture, down to the materials, colors, design of the structures that are built on the property, including the site plan. Again, something which can't be done through zoning. The other thing that you can do is, as I mentioned before, you can go through redevelopment without resorting to the threat of condemnation, which really removes a lot of legal risks and objections on the part of the public. So that really is something which is particularly advantageous. It also allows for a negotiation, essentially, of the standards and the conditions under which development may be implemented. And you can also, and you can't do this under traditional zoning, is you can specifically negotiate off-site improvements. For example, improvements to the streetscape, improvements to roads, walking paths, the building of facilities on adjacent properties, which can't be done under traditional zoning. There's a certain case law which prevents you from doing that. The other thing is the costs of going through the process, and it can be costly, including professional fees, your own staff, drafting of reports, and going through the process, can be charged to the redeveloper, so the municipality doesn't have to pay for that. Affordable housing, obviously can be part of it if there's a residential aspect. The other thing about a redevelopment plan, that can be held in place for a period of sometimes up to 30 years, which you can't do. When you do a rezoning, the next governing body, let's say that it changes, can undo that zoning, and there's nothing that the property owner can do about that. A redevelopment plan can't be held in place.
I hate to cut you short, but I got half an hour for Henry, and then I got the rest of the agenda. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go take it to questions.
Fine.
And ultimately, if you have any questions on this, basically it allows us to have control of redevelopment, and it puts us in charge. So that when the public talks about the planning board and representation and all this other stuff, the buck stops with us.
So what do you want?
I would like to see, you have a question?
No.
I would like to see that we move forward with the redevelopment agency, go to the zoning subcommittee, iron out the details of which model of zoning subcommittee that we want to do, and then bring it back to council for approval.
I'll make the motion.
Are there any other pros and cons to discuss? Anything that's related to what we have done in the past that would be eliminated by this new process?
No.
In terms of any of the pros or cons?
No, I mean, a lot of people don't realize that one of the most successful projects in Teaneck, which is the Glen Point redevelopment, occurred via this process. It later was changed to zoning once the initial project was done. But that was a huge undertaking which probably would not have occurred under zoning. But as I mentioned before, if you pick a particular area and it meets the criteria and you go through the legal process, then you can use redevelopment.
So it wouldn't be a blanket application, it's
No.
just by area of something that you're interested in.
The-
For example, senior housing, that could be an example of where we would work under redevelopment so that we would have more input.
It has to be geographic specific. So you can't say we're going to do all senior housing under
And a
redevelopment.
specific location.
You have to pick, the council has to direct, for example, the planner or the planning board to look at a specific area and see whether it qualifies or not. If it qualifies, then it's designated, and then you can do a redevelopment plan for that area. Maybe a single lot, and it may be a whole area. So it is a very flexible tool, and it can be used in a lot of circumstances, but it's very geographic specific, not use specific.
Jim and Keith.
I think two questions. One, is this now becoming the predominant way towns are handling this type of work?
I wouldn't say it's the predominant way, but I would say in the last 10 or 15 years, redevelopment has been utilized with much greater frequency because essentially development is occurring in already developed areas. And when you have existing development and multiple owners, it's much more difficult to implement new development or rehabilitation through traditional zoning. So redevelopment is being used. So it's being utilized throughout the state and very successfully.
One other quick question. What other advantages, other than obviously give us more control, what other advantages, if any, are there to do this redevelopment?
Well, you get to redevelop properties that under zoning or variances would not be possible. Sometimes you have an area that has disparate ownership, and so you can't get a single developer to come in and buy up all those properties to do a redevelopment. Under the redevelopment statute, the governing body has the power to declare that area in need of redevelopment, designate a redeveloper, and have that go forward. So it does work in circumstances where you can change the zoning, but nothing happens.
How long has this type of redevelopment system been operative in the state?
It's been operative probably since the 1940s, but there was significant.
Nothing new.
So it's nothing new. There have been significant changes both in the statute and in case law, which has really spurred the use of the redevelopment statute. As I mentioned before, the most recent one is utilizing non-condemnation, and essentially that now has opened the door for a lot of municipalities that were hesitant to do that for political and legal reasons are now taking
Non-condemnation under rehabilitation.
under redevelopment. Under rehabilitation, you can't use condemnation. In redevelopment, you have a choice. You can do condemnation and you can do non-condemnation. And in my opinion, you have the greatest chance of success if you can get the property owners to cooperate, where you don't have to condemn them. Then there's no risk, there's no threat. It's much better to work that way.
If you have information on the criteria involved, can you email that to us?
Yes, there's 8 criteria in the statute known as the local redevelopment and housing law.
I'll read it.
And there's some case law, and if you have any questions, I can fill you in. And there's also some criteria under the area need of rehabilitation. I'll provide those to you as well.
Thank you very much.
Just a question in terms of, is this thought of in the context of particular property that the council is considering already? Or that's one question. And the second question is, in my request for a comprehensive development plan, it seems like this would make sense to speak to this in that context. So it's kind of hard to have this discussion without the relevance of the actual.
So I think there's 2 ways. Go ahead.
And I
All the decisions in our town, we have an issue where people say that the planning board is not representation of the entire town. We have an issue where people say that things are being done behind closed doors. We have people who make all these accusations. The buck stops with us. This is why we get paid the big bucks. You have total control over everything, to the point where you can pick the color. To the point where you can pick the color.
To be a good thing or not?
No, it's a leadership thing. That's what we took the job for. So, I look at everybody in this room with a clear heart and say, what do you want? And then I'll say to you, this is what I agree with, this is what I disagree with. This is where I'll find things to work with them. And you have 6 other people where you can work on, and we can find a way to make work what's best for them. Rather than coming back and saying, where did that development come from? And everybody comes back and says, oh, there's an 11-story development that went to the zoning board of adjustment for. This one here, this one here, this one here. This gives us total control over everything that we want to do.
But I think that that's my point exactly, as opposed to saying after the fact. It's spoken in the context of, this is the opportunity, this is where it makes sense to apply this type of, as opposed to zoning, where it benefits the community by doing redevelopment, based upon the vacant properties that we have.
But you don't have to develop. You're creating the agency to give you the ability to say, okay, you want to do 4 stories, 5 stories, 6 stories, we want this kind of developer, this kind of development, this. We're making those decisions rather than an applicant coming in and saying, you have this zoning, I would like to come in and add an extra floor here because I can't go down.
Can I just add something? So one of the things that you can do is you can say the council is in favor of redevelopment and we'd like to look for opportunities, and then you can look townwide and you can identify potential locations, and then direct somebody to do a study to see whether it's qualified. Or you can basically say, we know this area, we believe this area does qualify, and we'd like to focus on this particular area or this particular property. So either one of those are acceptable.
With the development agency, from my standpoint, we consider it's the whole town. Right, we're not gonna target, I mean, we're gonna talk about the whole town.
Correct.
Then eventually get down to drill down
Yes.
to the DPW, Alfred Avenue, Cedar Lane Stop and Shop, the Teaneck Road, DPW facility, you know, all of DeGraw, parking, you know, what are we doing about parking? These are all decisions that, you know, we should be making.
And I guess that does put it in an overarching context. Right now, because now since we have the control, it will be in a contextual conversation that's, you know, overarching. It's not gonna just be, oh, well, this, we're deciding we're gonna do this particular property as opposed to a comprehensive viewpoint of what is needed in the community.
Correct. Goes to the comprehensive.
So,
They're looking at
I think that, you know, my standpoint is to, like, you know, again, the big issue has always been who's on the planning board, who's on the zoning board of adjustment. Okay, let's take that up and make the decisions here. If me and you have a disagreement about what we're gonna do, then people are gonna see that we can't, there's no punting.
And there can also be presentations to the community at large as to what opportunities are available.
Yeah, I mean, look, I have no problem, for the community to look at whatever they want. At the same time, I'm comfortable in a position where I know what I think is best from my standpoint in terms of, you know, how many units are stored on the area. Like if somebody came and said Avalon Bay should have been 50 units, right? Well, that's not economically possible, right? Just because somebody says, oh, this is a good unit. When somebody comes and looks at, what was that between the one on Palisade Avenue by the railroad tracks?
1475.
No, Palisade Avenue, like Haluba, you know, Haluba, you know, he still thinks that he's gonna do 23, 24 units per acre. You know, I think it's zoned for what, 8 or 9 or 11?
Well,
11? What is the zone?
it's going to be zoned from 12 to the 8.
Okay, so it's 12 to
Part of
the 8,
that housing
right?
element,
So,
fair share
you know,
plan.
this guy comes back and he thinks that he's, you know, oh, I think I can get away with 23, and I'm like, have a nice day, you know, it's not a discussion for me. So, where you get things that work, somewhere between 12 and 12. You know, that's what the zoning is, that's where I start from. But if there's something where it's beneficial to the town, we get to make that decision as a body. This allows us to have control. This allows us to say, this is what we need to do, this is the revenue, this is the right model. Either we make a decision yes, or we make a decision no.
I like the idea conceptually, but in the mechanics, we're going to function obviously as a decision-making body.
So this is where the concept that you just laid out here, right? You're not making any decisions. Now you're saying, let's kick it to the zoning board, zoning subcommittee, and then let's come back and have another discussion and more things to talk about. You're not making the decision tonight. Just like if you have a redevelopment agency, you're not making a decision to develop anything.
Right.
That's not what I'm asking. That's not what I'm asking.
Let me just
What
say
I'm
one
saying is
thing.
right now, what I'm saying right now is we're cutting into Henry's time. So that's where, if you want to know where, Henry put a lot of work into making the presentations and this and having the meeting, and, you know, we wanted it, Rosh Hashanah is on prior, so we had time constraints, Eve was last one. So
I just have one quick question. What's the planning board's role in the redevelopment agency?
It can vary, but in the same way that you have, so when you, typically what happens is in the designation process, the council will ask the planning board to undertake the area needed for redevelopment investigation and make a recommendation to the council. Council then decides, it's like zoning.
Same as ordinance.
And then when it comes to the redevelopment plan itself, is either the governing body can tell the planning board to go do the plan, or can say, we'll do the plan, but you get to review it when the plan is done.
Okay.
So the planning board does participate, and there'll be opportunities for the public to be heard at both the council level and at the planning board level.
Next. Okay, so I would like to make a motion to send this to the zoning subcommittee to come together with the redevelopment agency, present to council at the October. We'll get this done by October 9th, or we're going to do it in the second meeting in October.
When you say this, what
We create the creation of the redevelopment agency.
you'll have to speak to your attorney. It's up your valley, not mine.
You want us to give a draft, or you actually want us to create the entire thing?
The entire thing.
Okay.
by October 9th. Can we get it done? If you need more time, just say I need more time.
I honestly, I can't give you, I don't know.
Okay, so let's go to the zoning board, let's try, and then sometime we'll discuss it at the October 9th meeting, we'll put it on the agenda and hopefully for adoption at the second meeting in October.
Second motion.
Roll call, please.
Councilman Lenny,
Yes.
Councilman Rice,
Yes.
Councilman Pruitt,
Yeah.
Councilman Kaplan,
Yes.
Deputy Mayor Schwartz,
Yes.
Deputy Mayor Katz,
Yes.
Mayor Eden.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Great.
Thank you
I'm
very
going to
much.
turn the meeting over to Dr. Cruz.
Okay.
9 o'clock.